Hey everyone, I'm going to switch things up a bit today with my mystery reading to talk about a contemporary mystery novel by Lucy Foley. Foley has now 3 novels: The Paris Apartment, which came out most recently, The Guest List, probably her most famous one, and the one that I read early this year, The Hunting Party. The Guest List, in particular, ranks among the most read contemporary mystery books of the past decade. I hear about this one so often that I figured it was worth giving Foley's writing a shot for something a little different. Now, this novel was billed as evocative of Agatha Christie, so does it deliver? I realize too that if you're marketing these books, you'll probably just slap on feels like Christie on the description for any mystery, regardless of whether you've read Christie or anything else to compare her to. But I think in at least a few ways this does deliver some of the features that I often enjoy in Christie's writing. First of all, there's limited communication with the rest of the world, but this is adapted for a modern setting. By setting the novel at a lodge that has, can you believe it, no Wi-Fi, and is cut off from the surrounding area by a winter storm, we managed to get this closed environment, no Googling to a certain point. I mean, that kind of breaks down eventually, but a mostly isolated setup that characterizes a novel set 100 years earlier, but without having to actually create characters that lived 100 years ago, which was part of what made this novel feel like a new and fresh adaptation of a Christie mystery. How original is it really? I can't say because I haven't read too many other contemporary novels of its type, but it's certainly well done at the very least in a way that worked with a broader story. It didn't feel like there was some cheesy reason given for why the characters couldn't easily look up everything online, even though sometimes they get away with connecting to the intermittent Wi-Fi when it becomes really necessary. The setting and kind of setup also remind me of a common Christie trope, and one that I generally quite enjoy, which is to center the novel on a group of people going on vacation. Think Death on the Nile, Appointment with Death, and Evil Under the Sun, and probably many others from Christie. And this is a whole lot of fun because if the setting is conveyed well, it transports the readers to an interesting location, which in this case is a remote loch in the Scottish Highlands. And I have to say, Foley does a magnificent job of really transporting us into this harsh winter environment of the Scottish lodge, setting the scene without ever making the book be too much about this scene, without ever making the vacation environment steal the show from the actual plot. Likewise, Foley's writing style creates suspense, both plot suspense and an overall tone of eeriness, in a way that's both effective and tactful. Sure, occasionally it can feel a bit contrived when characters are clearly and specifically holding something back, or when chapters cut to a different character right at the point of an appropriate revelation, but for the most part I really did enjoy it. After all, Christie's not above that either, and I think the important thing is just for the author to consider whether it's being done in a way that will delight us readers with anticipation or simply frustrate us. Although on occasion, I think to myself while reading The Hunting Party that the numerous ominous interpretations of the surroundings were getting to be a bit much, I could tell that Foley was aware of this and at least towing her own careful line. For example, sometimes by taking us into the characters' heads, she'll show them reacting in fear to events that are immediately shown afterwards to be totally innocuous. It makes us feel the suspense and the eeriness in the air, but without feeling like it's too much over the top. There are a few of these repeated background insinuations, like a mention of poachers in the area or a serial killer on the loose, that felt a little bit strange to me because, well, as I figured it, they amplified the sense of danger, but I figured they never could really amount to that much. Could never really be a big part of the main murder mystery solution, because having an outsider from the group come and carry off one of our guests in their sleep with no motivation other than they love killing people feels like it'd make for a less satisfying conclusion of the story than if the killer was one of our party. Just how that does factor in the end, though, I'm going to have to save for the spoiler section, so I'll just leave it at that for here. What about the characters? Were they any good? Yes, some of them better than others, but several, mostly a few of the women who were especially memorable. In fact, I'll stop with the Agatha Christie comparisons after this and just look at Foley's novel for itself. But one way where I think Foley actually compares more favorably to Christie's novels is that her characters seem to have more emotional depth to them than Christie's characters. At least for the few of them that we follow more frequently, we'll feel like we've gotten to know them and their motivations by the end of the novel. And this is all the more impressive because these characters are not likable. The guests themselves are, by almost unanimous audience consensus, pretty lousy and offensive people who readers will enjoy hating on. Even this fact that they're rich, entitled, and spoiled and don't really seem to care at all about each other will probably make us less bothered that one of them is going to die and that perhaps another one of them is going to be a murderer. I don't think there was a single member of the hunting party themselves whom I'd actually want to be friends with, and they're clearly not intended to be so. And yet, I still felt myself sympathizing with some of their actual struggles, even while they repeatedly demonstrated to us that they're not the first people you'd consider deserving of sympathy. I mean, there's one character, and I assume everyone will feel the same way. One character who is really just awful. Yes, that one, if you've read the book, you know exactly who I'm talking about. But even that character, in the midst of their worst moments, still tended to surprise me, even if just a little bit. But I guess this is the point where I should give the disclaimer and really reiterate it. This book might not be for you if you don't generally enjoy reading these kinds of characters or you're just not in the mood for them right now. I still think they're written quite well, but I can totally understand why some people just might not be in the mood for dealing with these sorts of people right now. And also, while this character development was good, it did perhaps come at some expense to the mystery itself. On the other hand, we do have a few more auxiliary characters who give us the occasional respite from the intolerability of the hunting party themselves. We have Doug and Heather, who are kind of the investigators here, although not in the traditional sense, particularly as it's not ruled out that one of them could be the murderer. And the two of them end up being pretty interesting and will be more sympathetic if you're someone who has a hard time relating to the suffering of snotty people. There's also an Icelandic couple that at least 2/3 of the way into the book just didn't feel to me like they needed to be there at all. Like, they're just here. Why? Because we needed more outsiders to be suspects? A few people on Goodreads specifically commented that they found the character development boring. So if you don't really care that much about getting to know the characters in a mystery as people, then this might also not be your cup of tea. I do think that the character writing was probably stronger than the mystery itself, so let's just say a little bit more about that before I get into spoilers. Actually, I'll even tone that statement down a bit, because actually I really did like the mystery too. I found myself gathering clues, sorting out red herrings, and I actually did find myself immersed to the very end and eager to learn the solution, which for the most part did not disappoint. So let's just leave it at that. I think if you're interested in reading this type of book, I'd recommend it, as long as nothing I've said so far has put you off. Alright though, let's get to the spoilers, because we are going to need some of those to do this one properly. Last chance to tune out if you think you want to read it yourself before knowing the ending. Okay, one aspect of the mystery that I found interesting was we're not only thinking about who the murderer is, but also who the murderee is. By the time she was murdered, I was pretty sure I knew exactly who it was, because she is so offensive that just about everyone had reason to kill her. But still, it took a while to get to that point of surety, and even then, I still had my doubts every so often. Now, some readers may find this not knowing who was murdered to be a bit gimmicky, and I think I maybe heard as well that Lucy Foley does it in her other novels too, but this was the first time I've seen it done to this extent, so I thought it was a nice variation. What about guessing the murderer, though? Well, I definitely had various inklings throughout the novel. In my eyes, there were really only 5 main suspects to consider, maybe even fewer by the end, and okay, that's a bit of a stretch, but I'll explain why I thought this from a mystery writing perspective as well as from the clues themselves. The Icelandic couple, we're not even going to mention. By the end, I was still just trying to figure out why they were in this novel at all, which I honestly still kind of am. And then Heather and Doug, I mean, we knew that there was something unusual with Doug's past, but that seemed pretty transparently a side plot, which for me was totally okay. It was good for me to have a few side characters around that I at least trusted to not be just going around killing our guests. So now what about the hunting party themselves? Well, 3 of the 9 guests, Nick, Bo, and Samira, were like half characters, and by that I mean they didn't receive the same level of development as the others. Some have even said that they were like the token gay characters who had no actual development, which is kind of true. From a mystery perspective, though, this was fine because it allowed more space for the other characters' development. But it also meant that we knew little enough about Nick, Bo, and Samira that it probably would be less satisfying to have any one of them revealed as the murderer at the end. Though I couldn't totally rule out that I might have just missed some important hints somewhere. But even from a clue gathering perspective, there was limited opportunity to really find evidence or motive that they had been up to something really shady. And then if we're convinced that Miranda is the one who's dead, as I at least was by the end, then that leaves Giles, Mark, Julian, Katie, and Emma. And by the time we're well into the book, Katie and Emma even are probably more salient suspects than the rest of the bunch because we know a lot about them and they could potentially be the most satisfying with a good explanation, though I wasn't totally sure enough from that logic alone to say it simply must be Katie or Emma. And in fact, if you want to take the final step, I think you could even argue that Emma is, by the end of the book, is the one whose place within the narrative seems best fitting for the murderer, because by the end, Katie is receiving quite a bit of suspicion. We've seen a lot of attention on her, while Emma has receded into the background just a little bit, despite her being a pretty major character. It's like Lucy Foley doesn't want to tip her hand too soon until the big reveal at the end, which I also assume that she expects readers to pick up on. All that said, from piecing together the clues themselves, I did figure it out by the time I was maybe about 80% of the way through the book. Well, I guess figure it out is a bit of an overstatement, because I could not for the life of me understand the rationale for the killing. And frankly, I think it would have been impossible to really know that until the very end, since it wasn't premeditated. In some sense, though, this wasn't a mystery to be entirely figured out. It was one to just keep you guessing and entertained. But there were enough little clues peppered in along the way so that even if you couldn't figure it all out, you could figure out parts. You could probably figure out who it was. For example, although I didn't understand why, I figured out Emma was Miranda's stalker by about halfway through, and the telltale clues of that stuck out enough that I suspect many of you gathered this as well. But I knew at this point, okay, I don't know why Emma has some sort of weird obsession with Miranda, but I know she does, because I also remembered Heather remarking at the very start of the novel upon first observing the guests that one of them, who we knew to be Emma, was like an exact knockoff of another one, Miranda, simply a less attractive version. Not to mention the fact that Emma ends up marrying Mark, the man who had a thing for Miranda. And then later on in the novel, the missing gun was a nice final clue, since we'd learned previously that only one member of the hunting party actually showed any competence at, hunting. So I had a lot of fun with this mystery, and I enjoy being able to figure some of it out. Now, in spite of an exciting and mostly satisfying ending, I do think the whole last quarter or so of the book got pretty messy at certain points. The drug plot was okay, I guess. It wasn't anything that amazing, but it was okay. And that was the one part of the novel, too, where I just had to quiet the disbelief in my head that a woman on the staff at this lodge, Heather, would just go out by herself to investigate a missing gun without informing anyone else that she was leaving. I do understand that this was ostensibly because she was recklessly unconcerned for her own life, but this was one of those cases where the convenience to the plot seemingly outweighed the plausibility of the explanation, and therefore I had a hard time giving it a pass. By that point in the novel, though, I was kind of just wanting to find the final solution. It is what it is, though. Then there was this escaped serial killer thread, which I think could have been dropped altogether because it was pretty obvious that it wasn't a serial killer putting the murder in this murder mystery. And then finally, although the reveal of the killer was pretty satisfying to me, Emma going berserk after killing Miranda and deciding to kill Katie too feels, first of all, a little bit like cheap drama, and second of all, not really consistent, in my opinion, with what we've seen of Emma's character. I mean, up until this point, her killing of Miranda feels almost forgivable, like hardly premeditated murder or anything like that, especially given the taunting and provocations we saw here from Miranda. Of course, you could make the case that this is simply because Emma's whole life and personality were shattered here, but even then, it just makes you feel sorry for her, and it just feels at this point like the author knew that Emma remained a sympathetic character, especially as someone with a mental disorder. So she made Emma really snap and do something totally unforgivable so that the readers would find it easier to agree with her eventual sentence, which I guess is fairly lenient in the end, like without letting her totally off the hook. She gets 4 years in the slammer, so I guess maybe it works out after all. But as someone who likes to consider the morality and the extenuating circumstances in murder mysteries, which is admittedly probably a really bad quality to have as a mystery reader, this last part all just felt pretty rushed, given the pretty slow overall pace of most of the novel. And one other minor criticism I have is that sometimes the characters are holding back info in a way that feels unnatural to me and just doesn't work. The fact that they're holding stuff back is not in itself a problem. The problem is that they're actually being quite open about other stuff that is directly related to what's being held back, to an extent that it almost feels like a contradiction. For the biggest example of this, the way Katie is thinking about Julian, the father of her unborn child, as we observe her thoughts, but somehow she is able to compartmentalize this in a way that she avoids revealing the critical information to the reader, is just awkward. Like, the answer to this mystery thread was staring me in the face here, and I was looking at it and I knew it. I'm thinking, okay, so Katie and Julian are having an affair, except they can't be, because that just doesn't seem like it works with what we're seeing of Katie's internal thought process. Doug kind of borders on this issue sometimes too, basically beating around a certain thing that we're not supposed to know and exploring it from every angle, but still conveniently omitting the key piece of information that we're all waiting for, namely the reason he went to jail but is still not someone whom we should fear. I think it works a little bit better for Doug. Of course, actually, the most egregious example of this was the way in which the author conceals the sex of the murder victim even while describing the corpse and the crime scene. I'm sorry, but you just don't look at the body of a murdered woman and think, well, it's dead now. You think she is dead. She was a she when she was alive, and she doesn't stop being a she in our minds just because she is dead. I sure hope that at her funeral eulogy they didn't say it was a great person, because it was a she, and also because she wasn't a great person. She was a monster, but that's besides the point here. And okay, I'm giving Lucy Foley a hard time for this last point, but I'm just having fun here. Honestly, as awkward as it was, and yes, it was very awkward, it just didn't bother me enormously. That's the thing in The Hunting Party. For the most part, I felt like I could give little things like this a pass, knowing that they were just here to add to the suspense, and they did. So, The Hunting Party. Worth a read, and I enjoyed it well enough that I'll eventually be giving some of Foley's other work a shot too. So thanks for watching.